Hello students, we will continue with chapter 8, that is how do organisms reproduce. In my last lecture we talked about the various parts of a flower. So just to revise that, the flower hai kya? Flower is a sexual part of a plant. That means the sexual reproduction takes place through the flower. Flower is the sexual reproductive part of a plant. So inside the flower, the male sex organs are there, which are known as the stamen, and we have talked about the structure of the stamen. The female sex organs which are present in the flower, they are known as the carpels, and we have already talked about the structure of a carpel. Now in the carpel, at the base of the carpel, there is a conical structure which is present, which is known as ovary, and ovary के अंदर many ovules are present. Okay. Now fertilization के बाद we'll be talking about how the fertilization takes place, but remember fertilization के बाद जो ovary है that gets matured into fruit. So जो हम fruit खाते हैं, what is that? That is a matured ovary. Ovary after fertilization gets matured into fruit, और फ्रूट के अंदर जो सीड्स होते हैं दे आर द मैच्योर्ड ओव्यूल्स. सो आफ्टर फर्टिलाइजेशन द ओव्यूल्स दे टर्न्ड इनटू सीड्स. Okay, now before we talked about how the pollination and how the fertilization takes place, let us see the type of flowers. Now broadly there are two types of flowers. One is known as bisexual flowers. Bisexual flowers, they are also known as hermaphrodite. Actually hermaphrodite is a word which is used in animals also, like certain lower animals are hermaphrodite, जिसमें male and the female reproductive organs are present in the same individual. Similarly the bisexual flower के अंदर both the stamens, which are the male reproductive part, and the carpels, which are the female reproductive parts, if they are present in the same flower, then that flower is known as a bisexual flower. And the example of the bisexual flower, that is hibiscus, which is also known as a China rose, red color का flower है. Mustard, which is yellow color का flower होते हैं mustard के. And then the pea, जो वटाना और जो मटर हम लोग खाते हैं, that is a pea. So hibiscus, mustard and the pea, these are the examples of bisexual flower. Now second type of flowers, they are unisexual flower. Unisexual flower means in flower में या तो stamens present होते हैं, stamen means only male reproductive organs are present, and if only stamens are present, that flower is known as a male flower, and if only the carpel they are present, then the flower is known as a female flower. So in unisexual flowers, the male flowers are separate and the female flowers are separate. The example of the unisexual flower, that is papaya and the watermelon. So papaya and the watermelon, they are the example of unisexual flower. Now what is pollination? Pollination क्या होती है? Now pollination means for fertilization, अगर fertilization होनी है, the male gametes, अब male gametes कहाँ पे होते हैं? Male gametes, they are present inside the pollen grains. और pollen grains कहाँ पे होते हैं? They are inside the anther. So for fertilization, the male gametes which are present inside the pollen grains, they must fuse with the female gamete. Female gamete कहाँ पे present होती है? Inside the ovule. And ovule कहाँ present होते हैं? Inside the ovary. So for fertilization, the male gametes present inside the pollen grain must fuse with the egg, that is a female gamete, which is present inside the ovule. Now pollination, what is pollination? The process of transfer of pollen grains. ये pollen grains जो हैं, they have to get transferred from the anther to the stigma of the carpel. Carpel का सबसे ऊपर का जो part है, that is known as a stigma. So the pollen grains which are present inside the anther, they have to be liberated and they must get deposited on the stigma of the carpel. The process of transfer of pollen grains to the stigma of the carpel, that is known as a pollination. That means pollination जो है वो fertilization से पहले होती है. Remember, so before fertilization, pollination has to take place. Okay, now let us first talk about the type of pollination. Now there are broadly two types of pollination. One is known as a self-pollination and the other is known as a cross-pollination. Self-pollination always takes place in the bisexual flower. As the name indicates, that self-pollination, that means the transfer of the pollen grains to the stigma of the same flower. That means यहाँ पे pollen grains are also produced inside the anther and stigma is also there. That means the carpel is also there in the same flower. So the transfer of the pollen grains to the stigma of the same flower, that is known as a self-pollination. And remember, self-pollination always takes place in bisexual flowers. Whereas second type of pollination is the cross-pollination. Cross-pollination can take place in bisexual flower, but it takes place in unisexual flower. Unisexual flower में self-pollination तो हो ही नहीं सकती. So what is the meaning of cross-pollination? इसका मतलब है pollens of one flower. एक flower के जो pollen grains हैं, which contains male gametes in it, they get deposited to the stigma of another flower. दूसरे flower के वो stigma में ऊपर deposit हो जाते हैं. So the deposition of the pollen grains of one flower to the stigma of the another flower, that is known as a cross-pollination. Now for the cross-pollination to occur, certain pollinating agents are required. क्योंकि यहाँ से pollen grains कोई agent है, कोई चीज़ है जो pollen grains को ले जाएगी stigma तक. So in cross-pollination, the pollinating agents, they are required. And what are the pollinating agents? These pollen grains, they may get deposited on the stigma through the wind or through the water or through many insects like butterflies, moths, etc., or with the help of other animals. So this wind, water, insects and the other animals, they act as a pollinating agent. Okay, now this is just to tell you the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. Now this is both these flowers, these are bisexual flowers, because you can see the innermost whorl जो है, that is carpel. This is a carpel. नीचे जो broad part है, this is an ovary. ये ovary के अंदर क्या होता है, ovules are there, and this elongated part, that is known as a style, and style के ऊपर ये जो bilobe structure है, that is known as a stigma. So this is a carpel, and these are the stamens. Like this is a filament, and filament के ऊपर जो है anther है. So anther के अंदर क्या है, pollen grains, they are produced inside the anther. तो यहाँ पे देखो same flower में, यहाँ से anther में से pollen grains जो हैं, they get deposited on the stigma of the same flower. So this shows the self-pollination. Self-pollination में the pollen grains from the stigma of the flower, they get deposited from the stamen of the flower, they get deposited on the stigma of the same flower. This is a self-pollination. But यहाँ पे cross-pollination भी हो सकती है. Cross-pollination कैसे है? यहाँ पे these are the anthers. So anthers के अंदर the pollen grains are produced. These pollen grains, when they get matured, the anthers जो है वो open हो जाते हैं. After the pollen grains are liberated through wind or through insects or through water or by means of some other animals, these pollen grains get deposited on the stigma of another flower. So this shows the cross-pollination. So cross-pollination can take place in the bisexual flower. Self-pollination can also take place in the bisexual flower. But unisexual flowers में हमेशा cross-pollination होती है, because the flowers are either male flowers or the female flowers. Now let us talk about further after pollination how fertilization takes place. Now fertilization के लिए you know that this is a stigma. Stigma के ऊपर pollen grains, ये जो छोटे छोटे हैं pollen grains, they get deposited on the stigma. When these pollen grains ये स्टिग्मा के ऊपर डिपॉजिट हो जाते हैं तो दे स्टार्ट जर्मिनेटिंग. सो व्हेन दे स्टार्ट जर्मिनेटिंग, अ ट्यूब लाइक स्ट्रक्चर कम्स आउट फ्रॉम द पोलन ग्रेन्स. ये देखो, ये ट्यूब लाइक स्ट्रक्चर है जो पोलन ग्रेन से निकलती है. सो दिस ट्यूब लाइक स्ट्रक्चर विच कम्स आउट, दैट इज नोन एज ए पोलन ट्यूब. So these are pollen grains. This shows the germination of the pollen grains and the formation of a pollen tube. This pollen tube, it is formed, it passes through the stigma. ओके, अब पोलन ट्यूब के अंदर क्या है? पोलन ट्यूब के अंदर मेल गैमीट्स होते हैं, बिकॉज आई टोल्ड यू पोलन ग्रेन के अंदर मेल गैमीट्स आर देयर. सो दिस पोलन ट्यूब, व्हेन इट इज़ फॉर्म्ड, दिस पोलन ट्यूब इट पासिस थ्रू द स्टिग्मा. ये पूरा स्टिग्मा के बाद स्टाइल को, दिस इज अ स्टिग्मा. दिस पोलन ट्यूब क्रॉसेस द स्टाइल एंड इट एंटर्स इनसाइड द ओवरी. सो ये ओवरी के अंदर, ओव्यूल के अंदर चली जाती है. And the male gametes, they keep on moving along with the pollen tube, and they are again liberated inside the ovule which are present inside the ovary. So this is complete ovary. ये जो है, this is an ovary. This is a broad part which is an ovary, and ये जो elongated part है, this is a style, and ऊपर जो है ये stigma है. Now through the pollen tube, when these pollen grains they get liberated inside the ovule, तो ovule के अंदर what is present? The female gamete is present. अब female gamete क्या, कौन सा है? The egg. The female gamete or the female germ cell is egg. So these male gametes जो है, they fuses with the egg to give rise to a zygote. So this is how the fertilization takes place. So the male gametes which are there inside the pollen grains, they must reach to the female gamete which is there inside the ovule. So ये जो बीच में जो structure है, this is an ovule, और ये पूरी जो structure है, this is an ovary. As I told you, the ovules are present inside the ovary. Ovule जो है वो ovary के अंदर present होते हैं. So these pollen grains, when they fall on the suitable stigma, ये जो pollen grains है जब suitable stigma में के ऊपर आ जाते हैं, and the conditions are also favorable, they start germinating and they form a pollen tube. This pollen tube travels through the stigma, okay, and stigma से वो पूरे style में से होती है. This elongated structure is a style. So from the stigma it passes through the style and then reaches to the ovary, and inside the ovary it liberates the male gametes. Then this male gamete fuses with the female gamete which is already there in the ovule. This process is known as a fertilization. So what is fertilization? The fusion of the male gametes and the female gamete, that is known as fertilization. Fertilization के बाद one celled structure is formed which is known as a zygote. So zygote जो है then divides. Zygote is one cell structure, then it divides and it gives rise to an embryo. Okay, now that means embryo is formed inside the ovule. The zygote is formed inside the ovule. This zygote immediately start dividing. So बहुत से cells बन जाते हैं and ultimately that give rise to the embryo. So this embryo is present inside the ovule. Okay, now what are the post fertilization event? अब fertilization तो हो गई, तो इसके बाद क्या होता है? जो ovule है which is a fertilized ovule, उस ovule के अंदर क्या है? Embryo is there. Now this ovule जो है it form a tough structure around it which are known as the seed coat, because I told you ovule after fertilization give rise to seed. So fertilization के बाद this ovule it forms a tough covering around itself and turned into seed. So seed क्या है? Seeds are nothing but the matured ovule. After fertilization, these ovules they get surrounded by the tough structures which are known as the seed coat, like testa and the tegmen. These are the two seed coat, and in these seeds are the matured ovules. And what happened to the ovary? Ovary after fertilization it grows and it ripens. वो ripe हो जाती है, and this ripened ovary is known as a fruit. So what is a fruit? जो हम fruit खाते हैं वो fruit क्या है? Fruit are the ripened ovaries. And I told you ovary के अंदर क्या present होते हैं? Ovules. So ovules are present always inside the ovary. That is why we say the seeds are present always inside the fruit. So fruit is a ripened ovary and the seed is a fertilized ovules, and inside the seeds what is present? The embryo is present. Okay, now what is the fate of the sepal, petal, stamens जो है, which are the accessory walls, और बाकी जो stamens हैं, style है, stigma है, इन चीज़ों का क्या होता है, दे ऑल शॉवल्स, दैट मीन्स श्रिंक होके वो लोग, ये जो स्ट्रक्चर है दे फॉल ऑफ, ये गिर जाते हैं. ओके, नाउ दिस सीड्स जो हैं, एज आई टोल्ड यू, सीड्स आर ripened ovules. After fertilization the ovule turns into seeds. These seeds they contain the embryo. Seeds के अंदर embryo होता है, and when these seeds they get an appropriate condition, appropriate temperature and appropriate moisture is also there. When the favorable conditions are there, these seeds they starts germinating. When they start germinating, the seedling comes out. So these seeds, when get appropriate conditions, the favorable condition, then they start germinating. Now this structure shows the germination of the seeds. Like this is a gram जो चने होते हैं, that is known as a gram. So ये ग्राम सीड है. तुमने देखा होगा कभी इसको भिगो के रखो तो भिगोने के बाद वो it can divide into two structures. So these two leaf like structures which are there in the gram seed, they are known as the cotyledons, because this gram is an example of dicotyledon. Okay, what is monocotyledon, what is dicotyledon, you will be studying in the higher classes. So this gram is a dicotyledon. When it starts germination, the two seed like structures they are there, and these are known as the cotyledons. Cotyledons they store the food material for the developing embryo, क्योंकि एम्ब्रियो सीड के अंदर क्या है, एम्ब्रियो है, इस एम्ब्रियो ने डेवलप करना है, एंड दिस एम्ब्रियो हैज़ टू गिव राइज टू अ कंप्लीट प्लांट. सो अनलेस द लीव्स आर फॉर्म्ड and start doing the photosynthesis, this development of the embryo, it requires some food. That food which is required by the developing embryo, that is given by the cotyledons, and these cotyledons are nothing but leaf like structures which stores the food material. After this the embryo jo hai is a small structures comes out and start moving towards the lower side. Okay, lower side means towards the earth. That is known as a radicle. So first of all, when the germination of the seed takes place, the radicle comes out from the seed. Seed जो है वो seed में से एक छोटी सी structure निकलती है जिसको कहते हैं radicle, and this structure it starts moving towards down. वो it starts growing towards down. Okay, that is known as a radicle, and this radicle give rise to the root system. ये radicle जो है it give rise to the root system. So when we say the true roots are there, that means the true roots always develop from the radicle, and after that again small structures comes out and start moving towards upper side. Okay, and that is known as a plumule, and this plumule give rise to the stem and the leaves. That means further future shoot jo hai that comes from the plumule. So this is the germination of the seeds. That means initially the radicle comes out from the seed, and then the plumule comes out of the seed. The radicle give rise to the root system, and the plumule give rise to the shoot system. So with this the sexual reproduction in the flowering plant gets over. Next time we'll be talking about the reproduction in human being. Thank you, students.